So today we'll be talking about Chapter 33, Section 2. The title of this is Conservative Policies under Reagan and Bush. Presidents Reagan and Bush pursued a classic conservative agenda. This includes tax cuts for particular groups of people, budget cuts, meaning supposedly small government, and then finally increased defense spending.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory reports. Purification of laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Now, let's define what Reaganomics mean. And I'm going to try to outline Reagan's economic policies for you. For one, this president believed that private investment could be encouraged by reducing the size of the federal government. He called his concept Reaganomics. Like any president, they have to advertise and promote their ideas. So his catchy phrase was Reaganomics. And encompassed within this concept is conservative economic philosophy. And that is budget cuts, reducing the size of the federal government, means tax cuts. By lowering taxes, you increase the income of the average American. But then finally, Reaganomics also encompasses increased defense spending. And so that's what we're going to unpack throughout this lesson. What do these budget cuts mean? How were these tax cuts designed to affect the economy? And why increased defense spending? Number one, let's unpack budget cuts. Reagan claimed that entitlement programs meant to benefit the middle class were creating a culture of codependency. That by continuously bailing out the poor, we were teaching the poor to be lazy and promoting a sense of inferiority. And therefore, we were not providing people the necessity to fix their own situation. Essentially, Reagan was advocating a termination policy for the poor. And so he believed in cutting programs that would benefit the poor, that would benefit the urban population, for the purpose of teaching people to suck it up and fix their own problems. Conservative economics.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Ronald Reagan was not everyone's hero, but he certainly dominated the headlines that shaped the year. He promised a tougher line abroad, but at home, his chief target was the economy. He lowered taxes and slashed government spending. That was his recipe for boosting production and cutting inflation. They called it Reaganomics. The president needed all the friends he could get. His tough line was creating victims. America's air traffic controllers went on strike in August for better pay and conditions. It created havoc for a while, but the president had an answer. He replaced them with military controllers. Union leaders were led away in shackles and the Union itself dismantled. It was the kind of crushing victory even the president's supporters had not expected. What hurt more people were the massive cuts in welfare programs. In September, thousands of American workers gathered in Washington to tell the president it was no way to balance the budget. Economists also attacked the Reagan strategy. They said high interest rates were stifling investments and creating unemployment.
All right, so these tax cuts. Reagan's economic theory has been called supply-side economics. And this theory holds that lower taxes will result in greater investment into the economy, that is, private, voluntary investment. It will result in greater productivity, because with more investment into the economy, the American economy can grow, meaning that businesses can hire more employees. And so greater productivity means more jobs. And that with more jobs, we have a greater supply of money in the middle class. And so Reagan's theory was based on the idea that if we cut taxes to the wealthiest Americans, they will in turn invest that money into the economy. Ergo, investments into business will lead to an enlargement of businesses and greater investment, leading to more jobs, leading to more money into the economy. So if you agree with that theory, you are a conservative in regards to economics. And so Congress, remember, Congress was on board with Reagan's election. He gained a majority in the Senate. And so Congress decreased taxes by 25% over the next 3 years. So American taxpayers were slashed in 1/4. That's significant. Part of Reaganomics also preached, and Reagan's conservative coalition was based partly on the need for strong defense. And so throughout Reagan's presidency, the Defense Department's budget was almost doubled. Now, where did he get the money for this, you may ask? Wait, didn't Reagan just cut taxes by 25%? So part of this was paid for through cuts in social programs. So wait, Reagan took money from the poor to pour money into the military? Yeah, that's conservative economics. Where did he get the rest of the money? Well, let's see. So part of this idea of defense spending was to maintain an aggressive position towards the Soviet Union in hopes of ending the Cold War. In 1980, Americans were very concerned about the threat of nuclear war. It was part of our popular culture. I was watching G.I. Joe at the time. The big G.I. Joe movie came out in the early 1980s. And it was based on the idea that this global terrorist network was bent on destroying the world through weapons of mass destruction. We were raised on the fear of the threat of nuclear war. Reagan's solution to this was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as the Star Wars program. Star Wars had just came out, and so it was very popular to attach the idea of Star Wars to this global defense initiative. It was an anti-missile defense system. Reagan was proposing that we place lasers on satellites capable of destroying intercontinental ballistic missiles. True story. Here's a little more about it.
Then in March of 1983, Reagan decides to raise the stakes with a new initiative that the Soviets could never have imagined. It is called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as its detractors would call it, the Star Wars program.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Overstating it a bit, it was like it was on the grocery shelf and all we had to do was have the will and the money and it was here. And of course, 24 years later, we still don't have it, and we will one of these days, but he was way off in his time frame. He was very naive on that, but he was dedicated to SDI.
Many of the Russians said the only reason that Reagan could be developing SDI is because he intends a first-strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, and he doesn't want retaliation. That was about as dangerous as could be.
Adding to the Soviet fears of a first strike, Reagan also authorizes the deployment of American Pershing II nuclear missiles in West Germany.
Does he really mean it? Tough rhetoric, huge buildup, seemingly moving toward nuclear confrontation. People in this country were very concerned about it. People in Europe were concerned about it, and if the Soviets, if I perceive them correctly, they were very concerned about it.
Now, the period between 1981 and 1982, which, by the way, when I was born, so I was born during the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, this has recently been eclipsed by the 2008 recession, but early in 1983, consumer spending eventually fueled an economic upturn. And this did show evidence of more consumer confidence in the stock market. During this time, we did see a decrease in the rate of inflation, meaning that the value of money was not decreasing as quickly as it had been prior. And we also saw more employment. So, if we look at the history of the stock market, trace the Dow Jones from the Great Depression until the present day, you'll see a line steadily going upward. And that means that the gross domestic product of our country has steadily grown from the Great Depression to the present day. But you'll also see the line go up and down and up and down, and various reasons for this. Because in 1987, the market crashed once more, and then recovered, and then continued its steady climb. And so once again, we see this often. But the effects, unfortunately, are felt by the very poor. In fact, did you know that for every percentage point that unemployment goes up, supposedly 40,000 people lose their lives? So this has a real life and death type of significance. So Mr. Reagan was proposing smaller government. However, a reduction in price coupled with a doubling of defense spending means that we are going to outstrip revenue, essentially deficit spending. So President Reagan and his deficit spending to double the size of the military required new taxes, required an unbalanced budget. In fact, did you know that the national debt doubled by the end of Reagan's first term? Let me just say that again so it sinks in. The national debt doubled by the end of Reagan's first term as president. sometimes the economy can be simple. If you double the size of the military while cutting taxes 25%, granted, this is the, quote, good old days of conservative economics, but this is the result of what happens. It is the president's sovereign right to pick Supreme Court justices. Ronald Reagan appointed the first woman to be a justice of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. And during Reagan, who served a 2-year presidency, and his successor, George H.W. Bush, who served 1 term during those 12 years, other presidential appointments made the court much more conservative. And so during this time, the court placed restrictions on civil rights as well as abortion. And so remember, this conservative coalition included 3 basic groups of people. Those who supported the Republican Party for social reasons, the pro-family movement. Those who supported the Republican Party for economic reasons. These were called corporate conservatives, who favored the tax cuts on the wealthy. And then finally, those who supported the Republican Party for military reasons. The idea of the strong defense. There were many who supported this doubling of defense spending.
One of my proudest days in office came when I appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first woman in history on the United States Supreme Court.
Now, Reagan reduced the size of the government through deregulation. And this means that by reducing the number of regulations on businesses, the idea is this would make the cost of doing business cheaper. This would lead to increased competition because more people would be able to enter private business, which would lead to, through the free market, lower prices for American consumers. That's the theory. Because when we think about the free market and we think about globalization, what that means is that the lowest bidder wins, that we vote with our pocketbooks. And that also means the outsourcing of labor to the third world. That also means that where things can be made most cheaply, they can in turn be sold the most cheaply. And so that means that manufacturing jobs are going to go overseas. Reagan also cut the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency, because Reagan also began the era of the denial of climate change. And so part of the conservative coalition has been the denial of the idea that man has an impact on our environment. And so through deregulation and through the cutting of programs, Reagan believed this could reduce the size of the federal government and justify his doubling of defense spending. For example, under Reagan, the Interior Department, the department in charge of all public lands, it is through this executive department that our national parks are maintained, our national forests, our state forests, DuPont, Pisgah, the Smokies, etc., are maintained. And under Reagan, this department permitted more oil drilling, lumbering, and coal mining of these public lands. In fact, millions of acres of these public lands were sold off to private corporations. Now remember, this Reagan coalition, this idea of redefined conservatism, what groups are attracted to this idea? And a coalition means a diverse group of voters. You have people supporting the Republican Party for various reasons. Some of these are business people. These are the people we would call corporate conservatives who support the Republican Party because of these lower taxes for the wealthy. Groups of Southerners. Which Southerners as a block, well, that's too diverse, that's too big. We have to generalize. And so that's what Republicans do, in elections is think, how can we generalize? What statements can we make to this block of voters? What is it about Southerners that Southern conservatives value so much? And that's where, again, the Family Values campaign came in, claiming that America had lost its way in regards to morality. And this idea of social conservative attracted many Southern voters. Westerners, again, Republicans, and what Reagan was so brilliant in being able to do was to think and generalize about what do these various groups of people value. And so when thinking about Westerners, Republicans, again, had to generalize because we're talking about millions of people. And so by generalizing, the idea of conservative economic and social theory, the idea of small government, of government getting out of the way and letting people live their lives, that concept was very appealing to Westerners. And then finally, Reagan Democrats. What is a Reagan Democrat? Well, that is a former Democrat turned Republican. And we've learned through the 1960s and Truman's integration of the armed forces, what was it that caused Democrats to leave their party? And we learned that it was because of the Republicans' resistance to civil rights. And so Reagan knew he had it in the bag with former Democrats if he simply made small statements that communicated to Southern Democrats frustrated with their party's civil rights stance. All he had to do was make a few coded statements to grab these people, to just let them know that he wasn't a strong supporter of civil rights either. And so this leads us to the 1984 presidential election. The Democratic candidate chose to run against Ronald Reagan was Walter Mondale. Geraldine Ferraro was chosen as his running mate. So she would have potentially been the first female vice president. She was the first female to campaign for any type of presidential election. Why her name is significant. Unfortunately, this bit of history is trivial because Reagan and Bush won in a landslide. You see, this idea of the redefining of republicanism was very attractive and very popular. And again, this is why people point back to the Reagan era as the glory days of the Republican Party. Because even though today the Republican Party holds more elected offices than it ever has, even since the time of Reagan, you could argue that today the Republican Party is more powerful than ever. I mean, look at the state of North Carolina and you'll see we are a Republican-dominated state. We are a sea of red, if you will, with pockets of blue in various cities. But in terms of what does it mean to be a Republican, well, that's where the Republican Party is breaking up. That's where the future of the Republican Party today is uncertain. And that's why so many Republicans point back to the Reagan era as the glory days. Why? Well, because Reagan redefined what it meant to be a Republican, and he got a lot of people to jump on board. He was able to attract the, quote, elites through tax cuts for the wealthy. And we all know that the 1% has a huge degree of control. And so the Republican Party was able to attract that wealthy group by saying, hey, guess what? I'm going to let you get out of a lot of taxes. Ergo, I'm going to let you make lots more money. And so they were on board for economic reasons. But then, well, hey, the 1%, in regards to a democracy, they only represent a small amount of votes. So the Republican Party needed a coalition involving the poor. And so now they have to think about how do we sell this idea of tax cuts to the wealthy and greater defense spending offset by a cut in social spending. How do we sell that to the poor? Because what we're doing is taking money from them and giving it to the rich. And Reagan pulled that off better than maybe anybody ever has. In fact, his ideas were so popular. And to be fair, the middle class was growing throughout the 1980s. Many Americans felt economically comfortable. And of course, we tend to blame or give credit to the state of the economy to the president, though I hope we know by now it's not that simple. But since the economy was doing well in 1988, the Republican candidate for President George H.W. Bush kept stressing the ideas of conservatism. In fact, I remember this as a kid. His most famous slogan while running for president was, "Read my lips. No new taxes." Now, granted, that was a lie, but whatever. Read my lips. No new taxes. That's all Bush had to say, and that got him 53% of the popular vote, winning most of the electoral votes. And it was seen as a conservative mandate, meaning that Americans clearly wanted these ideas to continue. At least that's how it was interpreted.